Did.
Good evening, everybody.
Hey,
I don't know if my video's up yet, but I'm on.
Yep, it's coming. So we'll just get this rolling. Should be a pretty quick discussion. What is it? April 6th. So I'd like to open or call to order the April 6th Selectmen meeting with the following statement pursuant to Governor Baker's March 12th, 2020 order suspending certain provisions of the open meeting law and the Governor's March 12th, 2020 order concerning imposition on strict limitations on the number of people that may gather in one place. Meetings in the town of Upton are being conducted via remote participation to the greatest extent possible. No in-person attendance of members of the public will be permitted, but every effort will be made to ensure that the public can adequately access the proceedings as provided for in the order. So we just pulled this meeting together to have a conversation, and I'll open up to public comment in a sec if there is any, to talk about the town election, the date and ballot questions, the latest on the American Rescue Plan funding, and then also to see if there are any implications of either of those preceding two on the town meeting warrant. So with that, is there any public comment? Okay, so the first thing, and Derek, a lot of this is going to be sort of you updating us. So we had a conversation last week about the dates, the ballots, rescue plan funding, implications for the warrant and all that. So do you want to walk us through this?
Sure, I'm happy to do that. So as you pointed out, Mr. Chairman, a lot of this ties together. And so I'll kind of try to give everyone kind of a background of what's transpired over the past week or so to kind of set the stage for informative discussion. So at the last meeting, the board had voted to move a town meeting from Thursday, May 6th to Saturday, May 8th, with a rain date the following Saturday. However, since that time, there's been a few items that have been brought to light that I think it's worthy of a discussion, and that is the American Rescue Plan, and even to a certain degree the ESSER 3, which are two federal funding sources that have been recently approved by Congress. So what does that mean for us? So the school district, they receive directly ESSER 3 funds. There was a round of ESSER 1 and a round of ESSER 2 going back to 2020. And they've been able to use those rounds of funding to apply to the items that they need to hold in-person classrooms, virtual classrooms, and the proper protective measures they need to provide a safe environment for both teachers and learners. So they're getting a third round of that, and from what I understand, it's approximately $483,000. In addition to that, the town itself is getting funding, which is known as the American Rescue Plan. That funding amounts to approximately 2.4, little shy, somewhere between 2.3 and 2.4 million dollars. And that's an estimate that was put together by the Mass Municipal Association. So those figures aren't locked solid, but it'd be somewhere in that range. What we don't know at this time is how both the town and the schools can use what would amount to almost $3 million in federal funds. Now, the school committee, they had a subcommittee meeting at 4 o'clock, and they discussed a little bit about ESSER 3, and they talked a little bit about what they can consider as far as maybe a revised override number. I'll talk about that a little bit later tonight. But they said during their conversation today that even they're not quite certain what the allowable use of the ESSER 3 dollars will be. They can only assume based upon how they spent the previous rounds of funding. As far as American Rescue Plan, the $2.4 million, the Department of Treasury is still working on guidance. What we understand, it's been released by MMA, is that guidance will be released sometime in mid-April. In the legislation itself, it suggests that this money can be used for infrastructure, but in parentheses, they put water and sewer infrastructure. So the first question we'd want to know is, is it all types of infrastructure, or is it just going to be focused on water and sewer? In the legislation, it talked about using a percentage of these dollars to replace lost revenue for municipalities. The third component was to support local businesses. And so those are some of the items. And then last is to kind of assist with any additional COVID response. So there's a lot to understand about these dollars and how we can apply them locally. And this is concerning because, as we all know, we have on the warrant as it stands right now and as voted and approved by the Board of Selectmen at last week's meeting, an override at $1.4 million request by the school district, and then a $12 million debt exclusion. So I think it's important to kind of bring this all to light as we are right now scheduled to have a town meeting on May 8th. And I know that, in the conversations that I've had, some folks had, asked, what can we use these dollars for? And can we use these dollars to help mitigate any one of these two overrides? So I think maybe I'll stop right there because that kind of sets the stage for this evening's discussion. Laid on top of that, though, I guess before I do, is the election. So what is pressing us to a certain degree is that the election is previously scheduled. I believe it's May 12th off the top of my head.
May 11th.
May 11th. And so we have two issues with that. One, if we have to go to print the end of this week with the ballot. So if there's a decision or discussion to maybe hold off on the debt exclusion and the override questions, then we'd want to print that. We'd want the board to consider printing the ballot for just the general election. And then, we can talk about when the appropriate time is for the general election. There is a conflict with the schools for May 11th. So just to throw that out there, that under any circumstance, we'd probably have to move the election a few days just because of a conflict that's happening with the schools. And then if we were to hold off on those two ballot questions for an override and for debt exclusion, then we would have to hold a special election if we were to move forward with those, with one or even both of those items at a later date. So those are some items for food for thought for tonight's discussion.
And just so thank you. That's a good overview, at least to start the conversation. And I think you guys know me well enough to know that I'm reticent to change things like dates of meetings, times of meetings, not posting meetings. Like I think I never feel good about having to do that or choosing to do that. But in this case, what made me more comfortable or got me to a certain comfort level with the idea of making some changes based on the fact that we're not sure what's going to happen with these American Rescue Plan dollars and the ESSER 3 money. With that money, once we get the clarity, which will happen we expect over the next few weeks, we have the potential to either not have an override this year, right? So worst case scenario, we still have the override, we still have the debt exclusion, we can't use the money for what we thought. The second option is we can use some of that money. It gets us through the next year for the override, but we have to have the override question next year. So we sort of kick the can down the road 1 year. There are some scenarios where, depending upon what we can do with the $2.5 million, if we can apply that certain ways over the next several years to sort of flatten things out. For example, the roads budget, we could say, hey, $2 million for roads, that'll get us through. We spend that in the next 2 years. That essentially covers us for 4 years of road work in 2 years, right? Because right now we're doing about $500,000 a year of road work. So if we could use that $2 million for infrastructure, we do $2 million of road work in the next 2 years, and then we don't have to put that $500,000 in the budget for 4 years. So we essentially could be pushing off an override for up to 4 years because we can use that money. So given the shell game that's possible here of really using this money for what it is intended to do, which is ease the burden on taxpayers, if we can wait a few weeks and move these dates around and not have to bring an override to taxpayers, I think it's worth it for us. It's worth it for the town to make those changes. So there's a cost associated with any kind of change, you know, in terms of perception and you know what people think is happening, particularly when you've got questions like this. But I think the benefit outweighs that risk because, you know, again, anybody that you talk to, I can't imagine there's anybody that would not want to put off an override for 1, if not 3 or 4 or 5 years. So Steve, Maureen, there's a lot there. It took me a while to sort of digest. But what questions? Let's have the conversation and make sure we all understand sort of what's in play here.
Well, I think what you've proposed right there is very doable, and I would be in favor of postponing the annual town meeting to a later date until we have a better handle on what this art money is to be used for. The school is getting what, $483,000, Derek, which is not near what they need to go forward. I really don't have an appetite for an override at this time until we see what ESSER is going to do with it. I know we shouldn't be spending it on one-time we should be spending it on one-time expenses and not to balance budgets. But I would really like to see where the feds are going to come out with the ESSER and the art money on how to use it. I mean, I think the town side would use it for one-time expenses, and looking at what the school wants, I think they have to use it for budgetary things. And I don't think that's the right way to go either. I think there's other options for us.
Steve, what are your...
Okay. I'm looking at it a little bit differently. I'm looking at CARES Act money, for instance. It was very difficult for us to expend. It was kind of, you know, earmarked for a certain purpose. So now looking forward, we know that there's 3 rounds of ESSER funding. The 3rd round of ESSER funding netted $483,000. What I'm unsure of is what did the school district receive for ESSER 1 and ESSER 2? Does anybody have those numbers? You know, because I guess what I'm getting around to is, you know, we were able to procure $213,000 out of our CARES Act money for the school district. Mendon also procured $200,000 out of their CARES Act money. So if this money is really earmarked for, you know, commercial or not commercial, but let's just say infrastructure needs of the town, that gives us a chance to get caught up. You know we have some I&I problems in town. There was a discussion a year and a half ago regarding sidewalks on Maple Avenue. That's something that, you know, would be a good use for this money. As you mentioned, you could use it, or, you know, would there be a time delay? Like perhaps you can't use this money over the course of 4 years. We may have only 18 months to expend it or a year to expend it. So I don't think I look at this money, that ARP money, and say that's for the municipal side of the ledger. I don't think that helps, you know, the Library and Council of Aging, and I don't think that helps the school district. You know, the school district, you know, to be honest, you know, and I think I kind of have perhaps mentioned this, I'm not a fan of the override. I mentioned when I was 100% in support of the $213,000 that we were able to allocate to the school. My intention was, especially given the state of the economy, that this is not a year for an override. When I look at the numbers, and I listened to it last Monday, another pass through of the budget on the Mendon Upton Regional School District, you know, to me, some of those expenses are, you know, self-inflicted, if you ask me. But in any event, you know, I think we're trying to get back to normalcy. I think for 50 plus years, we've been having our annual town meeting in May. I really don't see how either of these two, we know the ESSER money is there. That's for the district to do what the district chooses to do with that money. It's that ARP money. And I look at that one more time. Look at the timing of those two funding sources. You know, does it make sense that the federal government's going to say, okay, we're going to fund your schools, you know, billions of dollars nationwide. In the case of our particular district, $483,000. We're also going to have this ARP money that's $2.3 million. But again, we may not be able to figure out a way to spend the whole 2.3. If there's a way that we can, you know, once again, help the district maybe with some needs they may have, you know, I would be open to that, but I certainly don't want to expend one-time money. And I really would like to, you know, certainly not towards wages. And it doesn't sound like that it could be even used in that sense. So, I mean, I'm looking at that ARP money thinking this is a great opportunity for us to get caught up on, you know, really, I'm thinking water and sewer issues that we have in town. You know, or personally, I think the sidewalk along Maple Avenue, this could be a good opportunity for us to, you know, conquer that and take care of a safety need, in my opinion, a pretty significant safety need that we have here. You know, trees falling in roadways, you know, that may be another opportunity. I think that's a good opportunity for us to get caught up. And that could mean warrant articles down the road that we're not going to have to ask the taxpayer for. We'll be, so, I mean, I think where I'm sitting, I think it makes the most sense to stay on our course. I believe the school recertified, so I'm not sure what the new numbers are, but I'm thinking maybe we just hold our course and stick with our original dates.
I would still want to push it out because the school has their own ESSA money for federal funding, and the town has the 2.3 or 2.4 million for the town side. And I would really like to make sure before we go to town meeting that we have some idea of what that money is to be used for. We may not be able to use any of the ARP money for schools because they have their own federal funding. And I really like to know that before I go voting for any override or anything. That's my take on it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what I was trying to get around to is I absolutely believe that that ARP money is not going to be used for the school. I just don't think you're going to release ESSER money and then give us the flexibility to use ARP money towards the school district. So I think that's a definite no-go. So now it just comes down to, you know, and this is why I asked the question last week, how much of the CARES Act money have we been able to expend so far? Because just because they give you that pie in the sky number, you know, it may not be attainable. So I guess if Kenny's within earshot, do we know where we stand with CARES Act at this point in time?
So, but definitely we need to, there's a few different things we should get answers to, right? I don't want to sort of muddle the water with too many different things at one point, right? I think the key here is, what do we do? Do we do anything with the dates? And help me, Steve, because I want to make sure I understand this, because my intent, or what interested me in making a change, was not having to request an override from the taxpayers or have the taxpayers fund an override. Because if we are able to, I don't think we're directly suggesting that we use the American Rescue Plan money for schools, right? So for lack of a better word, you have all this, you have money in your spend bucket, and you have, right, so there's ins and outs, right? So we've got this almost $3 million of new money coming in, and how can we use that to minimize the impact or the burden on the taxpayer? And my thinking is that if we can use that money that's coming in from the federal government to pay some of the infrastructure costs that we would wise normally sort of raise and appropriate the money from the, like for the roads, the $500,000 a year, then, and we can get the infrastructure investments we want, we can reduce the liability on the taxpayers, reduce the burden on the taxpayers, and still get the school some of that money that they would otherwise be getting through an override. I feel like that's positive, but maybe I'm not understanding it. I'm not understanding it the way you're explaining it or something.
I get what you're saying, but I think there's one other key component that maybe I didn't mention.
Yeah.
Road money this year, as it was last year, is set up as a raise and appropriate.
Yep.
So essentially, regardless, even if we were able to use all of that ARP money towards road money, that means that 462 or 492 goes away as a raise and appropriate. So you still have to have a ballot question for an override. That does not change the fact that you're, unless you went ahead, unless you went ahead then and modified your operational side of your budget. But, I don't think that's fair to the taxpayer. I think you still have to pose it as an individual question, and I think it still shows as an override.
So I think one of the things we were waiting for, Derek, because that's a fair point, right? Like I think if we still have to go for, if we have information now that we know no matter what kind of work we can do from an accounting perspective to not have an override, if we know that we're not going to be able to avoid an override, then from my perspective, this is moot and we're just going to go ahead with what we've got. So do we have the information now, Derek? I know there was a meeting today with the school committee. Were they able to make any accommodations or changes, or are we still at the 1.4 number? Just walk us through what the latest is on that, because I know, again, this is all evolving very quickly because the goal is to not have to do an override if we don't have to do it, because I feel like that's a positive thing, but maybe it's not, or I'm not understanding why that would be a positive thing, but go ahead.
Great. So this was the budget. The screen in front of you right now was the budget discussion, which was presented by Superintendent Maruchek this late afternoon. You can see here that at least the Upton's side of the budget, the operational increase is now being discussed at $992,000. Now, I just fast forward to the end of the meeting where that the subcommittee agreed to bring this new number for discussion purposes and maybe a possible recertification at next Monday's meeting. So how did they get there? You can see on the right side of this document, they removed the 7 new positions, and they applied the $483,000 of ESSER funds for a net reduction of $889,000. That reduced Mendon's, you can see, to $426, and it reduced the town of Upton to $992. So we've, as you all know, based upon the last meeting we had when we talked about an article for the override at approximately $1,042,000, we had already plugged into that budget. Remember, the original certification was about $1.4 million or thereabouts. And then so we applied an additional $440,000 to reduce what would have been the override down to $1,042,000. So we got $440,000 already plugged into the budget. So if the school committee were to recertify at this new number or a number thereabouts, if I take the 992 and reduce it by what we've already budgeted for the schools of $440,000, we would have a new net potential override of approximately $552,000. And this is all give or take, a couple of $1,000 here and there, but those are the approximate numbers of what we would be looking at, assuming the school committee supported not hiring any of these new positions that are listed here on the right.
So, and I was at that meeting today too, Derek, and so that $992,000, why wouldn't they reduce that by the $552,000 that we've already given them 420 or whatever?
Because this 992, this is just the town's new assessment, and it would be
Okay,
up to
but that's not going to be what we would put on an override, correct?
it wouldn't have to be. So as you know, we've already appropriated $440,000 already in the budget. So
Right.
automatically, this 992 would be reduced by that number, which would leave us a net balance of about $550,000 for discussion.
And the idea here too, I think, is one of the things we could do. And Steve, you're more well versed in these things, right? Is if we have a remaining balance, call it, of the 552, if we went to the warrant article or went to the warrant, there's a number in there right now for highway funding or for roads funding that we do every year. If we think we're going to get that ARP money and we're going to be able to allocate that towards roads, could we use the money that's in the warrant now to help offset that 552, and then we'd be left with an even smaller number to try to figure out where we could cover it and not have to do an override. Does that make sense, Steve? And is that, it may or may not be a good idea, but is that feasible?
I think it is feasible because I just don't know what that change is that will be left over. Like you said, we're 550. I just popped open my other laptop here to see if I could figure out what that road money article is. I thought it was 462 this year.
562.
It's 562?
It's 562, isn't it?
Yes.
562.
Article number 9.
And that isn't a one-time expense. It hasn't been a one-time expense because we appropriate it every year. So it could become part of the budget and then use the ARP money for the, $2.4 million would go a long way on infrastructure. And kind of that's why I would really like to push out the town meeting to see what we can use those ARP money for.
So yeah, before we do that though, I want to make sure that we're understanding what the current delta is that we have to cover. So the remaining, given the schools, if that new budget is what gets recertified, the balance, Derek, was 552, and we've got 572.
62.
562 in the article for roads. Okay, so we could actually completely cover it without any impact to the operating budget for the other departments.
Yes, that is true. If we could use those federal dollars for that purpose, that would be true, yes.
Or to the taxpayers.
Yeah.
Avoid any tax increase for the residents, minimum 1 year, maybe additional years as well.
But it's still a raise and appropriate article. So now instead of it being a raise and appropriate for road money, it's a raise and appropriate for the school district. So it still is, my opinion, it's still an override. You can call it's like last year, right? It's an override 2 years in a row for Mendon. And even though we didn't call it, and I call it an override, we didn't technically call it an override last year because we took those monies out of stabilization dollars. Yeah. But this is the same thing. We're kind of, we're manipulating some shells, but ultimately it is still an override. And I don't want to get in a situation where, I'm going to call it an override, but we're not going to call it an override, or
that's not
override, and it's not an override here. You know what I'm saying? I think it is what it is.
No,
I think in point in time, or you could push an override out to 2 or 3 years, however long the ARP money lasts, but it would already be built in the budget. So it would technically not even be appropriated the following year because it's already in the budget, and then you'd have to find money elsewhere, depending on what they increase the budget by.
Now, I guess another good question is, in the case of the ARP money, is that something that just the Board of Selectmen would decide how it's spended, how it is expended? Or is that something that we would have to, because if that's the case, you know, in theory, you would have nothing built into the budget. You would have no mention at all of road money. It would just be something we would discuss at a, you know, Board of Selectmen meeting in, say, April, May, and say, okay, we're going to appropriate X number of dollars out of the ARP money, and we're going to say, okay, this is for roads this year.
Yeah.
Well, Derek, is it my understanding that we have, 3 years to spend it?
The little information that I have been told that we have until 2024 to expend these dollars.
Right.
Okay, so so that makes sense that we've got 2 or 3 years to spend the ARP money. I'm assuming, Derek, we don't know yet what the process will be that we'll need to go through to expend those dollars, whether it's,
Right.
I don't know what the options are, through town meeting, through some other mechanism. Like, do you know typically how that would be handled?
Yeah, that money would typically be handled through the chief executive office. So in this case, it'd be through the Board of Selectmen office.
Right.
Okay, so we could at least make sure that we're sort of doing what we say we're going to do with it. So it's up to us. So that's good. I'm very sensitive to 2 things, Steve, that you said. One is I absolutely don't want to get into the game of, you know, we're playing a shell game so that we can not call it an override, but really it's an override. So I definitely don't want to create that perception with anybody. So if there's some increase to the taxes people are paying, wherever we call it, we need to make sure that it's an increase to the taxes that people are paying and they understand that. I don't care where it comes from. So I am sensitized to that. At the same time, I wonder, right, if that money, if we're using federal dollars to pay for something that we would have otherwise asked the taxpayers to pay for, you know, it seems like that's a net positive thing for the taxpayers because they're getting everything that they've asked for, which is the roads, and that's what they expect, and they want the roads, and then they're not having to pay for an override. And so, but so tell me again why that's not, or why that would still be considered an override. Or in your mind, whatever the language is, right? What is I just want to make sure I get that because I said I'm not getting it.
Well, right, I guess it's technically what they're talking about inside or outside of the levy limit.
Yep.
Right, is determining whether it's not an override.
Yep.
Right, but in this case, right, we're taking, you know, first of all, the school budget is up, whatever it's going to be up 5. They were asking for, what was it, 6.7%, and now it's probably going to be maybe 5.5 or 6%, whatever that number is.
Yeah.
You know, in my mind, that's an override. In the Mendon taxpayers, it's an override for the Mendon taxpayers. Again, creative ways to pay for it, but again, in my mind, it's still an override.
Got it. Because I think to your point, right? Like people think of an override as being associated with schools. I think that's, you know, again, right or wrong, that may not always be the case technically, but generally speaking, right, Steve, that's right. That's what people think of an override. The school budget's gone up significantly and we've got to fund that. And if we have to go outside the levy, that's an override. Is that what you're thinking? And so regardless of how you think if the school budget's going up 5%, you know, that's more than the 2.5%. So it's outside what the normal levy would be.
Right now, I mean, we do have departments, for instance, that have had their budgets increased by more than 2.5%, but they're small budgets, you know, very small composition of our overall budget. You know, We're talking about a large composition of our overall budget. Obviously we're funding 12.2 million, I think was last year's number. And, we're going to pick up another $950,000. So that's going to put us at, whatever that number is, 13,100,000 and change. Like I say, I think by the technical, letter of the law, you would say, okay, by deleting your road money article, and, if there's something else that we can move around in the budget, by the technical letter, I suppose it's not considered an override. But don't forget, we kicked it down the road a year already.
Right.
So, in my mind, it's 2 overrides in a row.
Yeah.
That's.
And so maybe is there a way to think about that, right? So it's then if we're gonna think of it, sort of just not technically, but like just from a fundamental perspective, I don't know what the right way to position this is, right? But like, so the schools are at, we're thinking the school's budget is going to go up by $1 million. That's much more than it would normally go up by. And then there's 2 mechanisms that we have to proceed, right? One mechanism is the way we've been planning and the way we've been talking about, town meeting talks, we talk about the funding for the school. We approve that. If it gets approved, if it passes, then it goes to a ballot question and it gets voted at the ballot. The other option is to try to avoid the technical override, but still fund the schools, use the ARP money. And there still is that debate on town meeting floor about whether or not we fund the schools at this level. So that debate would still occur, even if because to your point, we would still have to raise and appropriate that money for the schools. So there would still have to be an article to fund the schools. There would still be a debate and a vote on it, as opposed to like, we're not just deciding that, right? Just from a sort of protocol perspective, right? Like a legislative process perspective.
Right. Yeah, I think you're correct there. And obviously, the other point that we really haven't spoken about is the way it's drafted now, we're going to have a question that will be debated at $1,042,000. Now that question changes and the question will be $550,000. So you would think it's going to be much less contentious. My gut feeling is I did not think it would pass. I thought at $1,042,000 it would fail. Yeah. So again, I could be wrong. I usually am, it seems. But in this situation at $550,000, I think it's a much easier burden or pill to swallow for the taxpayer.
Yeah. 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 Is there a scenario, Derek, where and maybe there's more risk to this than we're willing to take, right? But there is a possibility that if we're assumptive, which means if we assume that we're going to be able to fund roads in some way, shape, or form from this ARP money, and we're assuming that that's the case, then all we would need to do now is we don't need to change the dates of anything. We would essentially just say we're going to have the debate about the raise and appropriate for the schools at the incremental money that we've asked for, the 562. We're going to take out the spending for the roads, and we're going to proceed. And worst case scenario, for some reason, it's implausible to me how that would work, but for some reason we can't use the ARP money for roads, then we don't have the extra funding for roads this year. We've got the Chapter 90, and then we're back to square one next year for putting in the $500,000 back in the budget for roads.
Yes.
And I guess okay.
Let me ask you this, Derek. If there is, you said that some of the ARP money is for water sewer infrastructure, and where we could still do road rework if we dug up roads for water and sewer, correct? So the ARP money should be able to pay for that along with the water and sewer infrastructure.
Yeah, I'm tracking this. So just so everybody understands what Maureen is saying, is if we replace a water main, on Warren Street, for example, the op money should be able to cover the resurfacing of that road, right?
Right.
I think that's what you're saying.
Yep.
So I think it's a great point. I think it's something worth exploring to see if that would certainly be included. And so I think that's kind of the crux of this matter. Is just we don't have a lot of information, and we're going into town meeting with a $12 million debt exclusion and a $1 million override. And so do we run the risk of putting these questions forward in front of town meeting members without having vetted all of these federal dollars to the fullest extent prior to putting these questions forward?
So the other question is, so maybe, but I think that's what we're trying to figure out, right? If we can essentially accomplish both goals, which is not changing the meeting, but still not doing the override, then I think, right, like that sort of is the best of both worlds, because then we're not changing the meeting schedule or structure. We got to make a change to the warrant based on the new budget, which we have time to do, I think. And so the election date stays the same, the town meeting dates stay the same. Sounds like we might have to change the election date because of the schools anyway, but that's a separate issue, I guess. I mean, I would be comfortable with that approach because I'm confident enough that the $2.4 million we'll be able to use for roads in some way, shape, or form. Either, Maureen, to your point, as part of sewer and infrastructure. Steve, to your point, we've got I&I, projects that have been identified, so we can do those. Those include road work. So, you know what, if it's not just road money, if we're doing sewer and road associated with the sewer, then that's money we'd have to spend anyway. So it's 6 of one, half dozen of the other to me. So I would be comfortable with that, unless again I'm missing something, and maybe there's the variable. I don't think any of this has to do with the community center, Derek, right? We still need a debt exclusion no matter what, so that's not going to change.
Yeah.
I think there is something worth noting, Brett, that I guess as we're working through this and throwing out ideas, if we obviously, assuming that the school budget gets recertified and that number changes, we would need to just adjust down that number for that warrant article. But if we're very comfortable, as you mentioned, that the ARP money or ARP money or rescue security money, however they're phrasing it, can be used towards roadway, we can always table that article. So again, it's Article 9 is road money. So when we get to Article 9, really we could just go to print with it as it is. When we get to Article 9, we can just table it, pass over it, however it is that we want to choose.
That's a good point too. Then we sort of, right, because that one doesn't require a ballot question. So I think that's why we were it was a little funky with the school budget, because it was like, do we put it on the ballot or not? But for that one, we can just leave it there, we table it, and that's a fair point. I mean, it's a great point. Good. So then we would for the warrant, we would end up rewording the school budget one to the whatever the number. Now, but I guess that's the question, right? Because would we want to, if we reword the school one, it would be a different amount whether we do that Article 9 or not, right?
And still go for the override.
Well, I think we don't want to go for the override.
We don't want to go for the override, but if you don't use that road money, you have to go for the override.
Yep.
So is that what the board wants?
I think what I'm, and maybe again I'm misunderstanding, but so I think what I was thinking was we could not use that, basically pull Article 9 and use that as put that towards an article for the raise and appropriate for the schools. And Steve, you're talking about leaving Article 9 to confirm that we could use the 2.4 million for roads and then pulling it out.
Well, you'd have to hold a whole other town meeting then to finalize it. If you table the $562,000 for the roads for the school, And if they don't get the override, you want to give that $562,000 to the school, then you have to go back to town meeting. I think, Kelly, right?
Yeah,
If they
I don't,
table it, you'll have
I
to
don't,
hold another town meeting in order to appropriate it to the
I
schools.
don't think that's what we're talking about.
yeah, that's not what we're talking about.
And you can't table it. You either have to vote it or dismiss it.
We're talking about two different things. We're talking about two different things. So what, right? Because, so Steve, talk to me about what you're thinking, just again, because there's three of
Yeah.
us, so we all get it.
Right. So I think what we're trying to say is we could leave it in place, make sure we're 100% certain, and we'll know that well in advance of the meeting, really.
Yeah.
So we'll know that we're 100% certain that we can use that rescue money exactly the way we would use road money. The only question I had earlier was, I think that's something that we may be able to just expend as a board.
Yeah.
So again, we table Article 9.
Yeah.
I think Article 2A, I'm reading it kind of out of the corner of my eye. I think now you just get to a technicality of, again, the dollars is going to change, but we can't do that yet until we know for certain next Monday that it gets recertified. Once we know for certain that it gets recertified, then 2A is going to change. The dollar figure will change.
Yeah, and it goes from whatever it is now to the amount that it would be if we use the Article 9 money, right?
So what makes you think that we'll be 100% certain that we will know what we can spend that federal money on by the time town meeting comes?
Well, Derek said that the legislature is going to be meeting in April to determine that. So we're meeting in May, so I'm just assuming that the federal legislature will do their job and give us the proper guidance. I guess that's a leap of faith.
We certainly won't have less information than we have now. So at a minimum,
we won't have less information. That's true.
Right.
So Derek, is this making sense? Are we tracking? Or are we not here?
Yeah, you're making sense regarding the warrant, and Kelly's gonna have to jump in and help us with the posting of the election. So what I'm hearing you say is that because we can still stay on the current cadence of the May 8th town meeting, because we still have time to make any changes to Article 9 and Article 2A. That's kind of what I've heard. However, I don't feel like we have that flexibility with the election and the ballot questions. Because I understand the ballot questions have to be approved no later than 35 days in advance of the election. So we have to look at that timeline, because I assume that if you wanted to change Article 2A, for example, reduce that Article 2A to a number that maybe the school committee recertifies at, I'm assuming you'd want to do the same for the ballot question, right? And I don't know if we have that luxury.
Well, but I think we don't want, if we do what I'm thinking and understanding is that we change 2A, assuming the new numbers work. If we can make 2A work with the new numbers, we can not have 9 in there as a maybe if we can use that if we can use the art money, and don't put there is no override question, because the only question is, do we use Article 9 for roads or not, right? Do we have that sort of extra money for roads or don't we? And so we say now, we know we're not going to have an override one way or the other, so we don't have to change the ballot, and then we're going to leave Article 9 in there so that we can make a decision on that, closer to the town meeting when we have more information about what we're going to be able to do with that art money, and we sort of go from there. At least that was my intent.
Yeah, but I guess that's based upon the premise that the school committee does recertify. So,
Right.
Going under your scenario, we are taking a leap of faith that we're not going to have an override ballot question because we're going to make this work using Article 9. But that's based upon the new number of 992,000, not the old number of 1.4 million.
Right.
I guess,
So,
so what
what-
happens, I guess
so
my
what-
question is, what happens if the school committee does not recertify and they keep it at
Well,
$1.4 million?
well, let's assume for now that they do recertify it and just talk through what that scenario looks like. So assuming they are going to recertify, what's the time at which we would absolutely need to finalize the ballot, Kelly? Is it between now and next Monday? I'm
It is
assuming.
today. Today is 35 days before the annual town election. Even
Okay.
if we move the annual town election a week for a school, today is 35 days.
Okay. So if that's the case, I assume we have till 11:59 p.m. Is that the?
Take a vote? Yes, if you want to stay on till midnight.
Yeah, okay.
Can I say something here for a second? What
Sure.
I'm picturing is you keep 2A on there in case the school does not recertify the amount. You add another warrant article that appropriates the $552,000 to the school without an override. And then we move without an override, but they get the extra funding because we're not going to change the operation budget. We're going to do it as an article, I would imagine. Maybe. That being said, if we find out that we can use the op money for roads, we pass over Article 9. Then what happens is we print the ballot with the elected officials and the debt exclusion, and we have that on March 18th. Then we turn around if we find out that the school cannot, that they don't recertify, or we need the override money by May 5th, we can then have a special election to have the override question on it.
Now, I was going to say earlier, just a quick kind of clarification. So Brett, I know what you're saying, and basically if that Article 2A is rewritten at 550,000
Yeah.
and we pass over Article 9, let's say we're rolling through 2A passes, we pass, we table Article 9,
Yeah.
at that point, we do not have to go to the ballot.
Exactly.
Would no longer be which we're underneath we're under the levy. So you're right, we wouldn't need that question. So, but again, we don't know yet. We don't want to
Yeah.
leave ourselves short on road money. And we
Yeah.
have the other question mark, which is we don't know for certain if the school will recertify. I can't imagine that they wouldn't. So I guess the question is, but I'm all about simplification. And to do what you're saying, Kelly, we would therefore need to reopen the warrant to post another warrant question. So now if now we reopen the warrant, we've got to
Yeah.
open it for a period of time. I don't want to open it tonight, close it tonight. That looks kind of shady. So I wouldn't be in favor of doing that. So I'm just wondering if there's a way to, on town hall floor, maybe this is a question for KP, on town hall floor, if we have two new pieces of information, those two new pieces are, as you've mentioned, Brett, how can we use the rescue money, A, and B, is the school committee going to recertify, which we'll know that next Monday.
I'm thinking that you could pass 2A without the language dependent on a 2.5 prop override ballot.
Okay.
That's a KP question, but to that scenario, Steve, yeah, we wouldn't have to add another article because we could use 2A to either one, fund an override with a special election question in June if they don't recertify, or two, change the motion for 2A to not be dependent on a Prop 2.5 override.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was thinking. That's what I was getting around to, is if we could ask them if we could just, on town hall floor, change that. And that gives us plenty of flexibility. I think that's really the best of both worlds, Brett. I'm not sure Maureen, I'm not sure what you're thinking.
I have to be honest with you. I think it sounds good. I don't fully understand it. So let's if you humor me a little bit, because I think what I'm hearing is we have the flexibility within 2A to either fund the full amount of the current school budget or the recertified amount. And so basically, and do either of those without having to do the override question as a ballot question. Is that?
Keep in mind, you don't need to do the ballot question on the annual town ballot. You can, the selectmen can call a special election in June.
We need, okay, I gotcha. So that's the piece there, Steve?
Well, see, I wouldn't like to do that. That's why I was thinking, we could, I guess what I'm thinking is you print your ballot with Article 2A as a ballot question. It becomes a null and void question, I think, Kelly, and you would be the officio with regard to election. But if that goes to the ballot, but the budget's been recertified and we can fund it within the levy, it becomes a moot question. Can you pull a ballot question after the annual town meeting?
Tonight is the night that I need this Board of Selectmen to vote on any questions that are going to be placed on the ballot. Last week you voted the debt exclusion and the override. So right now that's what I'm going by.
Right,
so,
but I think, go ahead.
So if the ballot question is on there, my personal opinion as an elected official, we don't want to put a ballot question unless we know we absolutely need it, because there'll be a lot of people that are going to be voting by mail in other ways, and they're not going to get that explanation that it's not needed.
Okay, but I think to Steve's point is, if it's on there and it's not needed, what are the implications of that, whether it passes or not? It doesn't affect, what are the implications of that? Are there any?
If it passes, I report to DOR that we raised our levy limit by that amount of money.
But the amount of money is not in the question.
Yes, it is. It's the debt exclusion that doesn't have the amount of money in it.
Oh.
So 2A is written right now at $1,042,672. But I guess.
So right now, as it stands right now, there's $1 million override on the ballot. And
Yep.
if the school committee is moving forward and they've already and we think they're going to reduce their budget, where opt-in quote doesn't need an override because we can fund it inside the levy limit, my personal recommendation as an election official is the selectmen vote to remove that question from the ballot.
Yeah, I think
Yes.
that's clearly our intent, or that's what we're trying to get to. We just want to make sure we're sort of covering all the scenarios here.
And then you keep Article 2A on the warrant. If we find that things change with the school committee, Derek, do you think we can motion or amend 2A within the moderator and not make it dependent on Prop 2.5 override?
Yes, I definitely think we could do that. Yeah.
Okay, so 2A will fund the $552,000 extra that the school needs to make their $992,000. We pass over Article 9.
Yeah.
And so the ballot will be held after the town meeting we're hoping for March 18th, but again, on May 18th, we're going to talk about that later. So that being said, if the school doesn't recertify at the lower amount, we have 2A on there, and it's dependent on an override, then the selectmen have a date that they can set 35 days in advance to have a special election in June with the override question only on that ballot. Which Upton has had the precedent of doing that.
Yeah, wouldn't you hate to have another election? I think what I'm thinking is we don't have enough information at this particular point in time, to pull that particular article.
So again, it goes back to what Derek explained to you.
Not the article. You're talking about the question, Steve?
Yes, I'm sorry, the question.
Yeah.
We don't have enough information to pull it off the ballot.
Right. So again, it goes back to that question, do we want to delay town meeting and we elect the officials based on the annual town election date? We delay town meeting when we have more information, like say we do it so many days, I'm just putting it out there, we do it so many days in June, Then then we're going to have a special election anyway. I think either way, we're going to have a special election. The only way we wouldn't have to have a special election is if the school committee recertifies their budget to the 992 and we cover it with the votes article. That's the only way we don't have a special election.
Right, and I think that's what we're trying to do. So, Phil, if I know you're here. I'm not sure how closely you've been paying to this very exciting and interesting conversation, but I may put you on the spot, Phil, to just see if we have any sense of where was it the school committee that met tonight or this afternoon?
No, it was only the budget committee that met today.
So it was the budget subcommittee.
So
Okay,
the school
got it.
committee will be meeting on Monday to
Yeah,
review basically what Derek just shared with you.
Yep.
And to discuss what those cuts mean and the impact of that, and to then in turn vote on how we will look to, if we'll look to, and how we would look to adjust the budget moving forward.
Okay, gotcha. And I mean, obviously, I know you can't speak for the school committee, but so the budget committee, was that sort of mixed support? Was it unanimous support? I know obviously it was, Joe and Jay, or Joe was sort of supporting it and advocating for it, I would think. Was it the whole subcommittee, the budget subcommittee, that supported it, or?
Yeah, I think it's what I would say right now is it's a mixed level of support, but that's not driven because people want or don't want it. It's driven because there's still some work to be done in terms of, just like you're looking at in terms of your the new American Recovery Act, funding, and we're looking at the new ESSER 3 funding, trying to understand what that could be used for. There was some guidance that was sent out at the very beginning of the month from a Boston law firm that basically kind of outlined uses and things like that based on what the acts had indicated. But I think we still have to do some work around, what costs are in the budget and how might we be able to, supplement the pieces to be able to reduce them with the funding that we're being given. So there's still, I think part of it was driven basically because there's still some work to be done between now and Monday. So we can look at it effectively.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah. So Steve, to your point, like I'm just reticent to change these dates, but I'm also reticent to bring people back for a special election to do an override. I don't know that it's totally the end of the world. But I think if you put my feet to the fire, which they're pretty much on the fire because we've got 3 hours and 57 minutes to decide. My preference would be to, right, like I'm sort of a positive attribution person. So if I have to make an assumption one way or the other, I'm going to go with what my hope is, that we don't have to ask the voters for an override, and say, let's assume the scenario that we all hope will come to fruition, which is the school committee recertifies, we can use the ARP money for roads, we can pass over Article 9, we can use 2A to fund the 552 above and beyond what we had anticipated, the originally allocated to them, and it all works out, and we don't have to have the override question. To me, that's the best case scenario. That's the one we all want to happen. That's the one we hope happens. And so I would be an advocate for going with that, pulling the question off the ballot, keeping the election, the town meetings on the same cadence, sort of honoring our commitment to the community, but also giving ourselves the flexibility if needed to sort of go back, and if we need to, we can go back, but certainly that's not our intent to go back with a special election. So I don't know, that's sort of where I'm shaking out on all this.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I'm with you on all of that. I guess the only thing I had suggested earlier is leave it in place just in case. But if, I think all of us, I think all of our best guesses, and I think based on what Phil has just reported to us, I think that, in all likelihood, that's going to be, again, that number we mentioned earlier, 550 or 552, whatever that number is. And I think you're right. I'd like to just keep the dates like they are. And I'm fine if Maureen, if you're on board with that, if you think that makes sense, then what you're saying, Brett, is we would, from the ballot, we would remove the question pertaining to the override.
That's right.
Okay. And then just the only stick in this, folks, is we would have a tough decision to make if the ARP money was not available to use on roadway. Then we'd have a difficult decision because we'd either have to reduce that number, go back to the operating budget, or have an override question, again, a special election for an override in the amount of whatever that amount. We either whittle it down or it ends up at 550,000 for the override. But I'm fine if you two are fine. If both of you are, again, I'm fine with that if you'd like to remove 2A.
Remove the override question, you mean?
Yes.
Yes, sorry about that. Yep.
Okay, that's okay. What do you think, Maureen?
I can go along with that.
Okay, so we'll take a motion to remove, what is there, do we have to do a particular question, Kelly, or do we just have a motion to remove the override question?
I would make a motion to rescind your vote from last week to place an override question on the ballot.
Okay.
Kelly, was there a number with that? Would that have been question 1 or question 2 or anything like that, or no?
Override was question 2, and it was 1 million. It's whatever 2A is, that 1,042,000. Yeah.
I see it in front of me, yes. Maureen, you're good with that?
I'm good with that. Make the motion, Steve.
All right, got it. I would make a motion that we rescind the vote that we made at last Tuesday's meeting regarding question number 2 for our ballot, which is an override question in the amount of $1,042,672 for the purpose of funding an override for the Mendon Upton Regional School District. Stephen Mattelli and I.
Second, Maureen Dwinell, aye.
Brett Simus, aye, unanimous action. Okay, so that's a big one. So that means we can stick with the what are the dates? May 8th and May 15th for the town meeting, so those don't change, right?
Right.
Then the only other thing I think that you were saying might need to change, Kelly, is the May 11th election date.
Yeah, so May 11th, keep in mind, if we have to, there's 2 things. The major reason is I reached out to the school when they came back full time, and on May, they used the gymnasium for lunches for social distancing purposes, and as well as on May 11th, they have to administer 80 plus AP exams that they have to have everybody social distanced. So if we originally, I was thinking if we pushed it off to March 18th, it would be, and the override question was on there, now it's not, we'd be voting the same day as Mendon. But on the flip side, Mendon's election is that day too, and the override would have been voted on the same day in both towns. But that being said, May 18th, the school can accommodate us, and if we have to push the town meeting to the rain date of May 15th, we would still be having the town meeting before the election. So things like the school budget can be addressed and the community center can be addressed before people actually come out and vote on May 18th. So I'm just looking to delay it a week.
Has there been any consideration to just having the election just like the old days at the town hall?
We could, and we could go back to having it on May 11th. I think, it was something that I did think about, and we could definitely handle it for the one day on May 11th. However, to change the location, you guys, it's allowed under state law at this point, and we could make the case for it because of social distancing purposes. But for you to take a vote to change the location would have to be posted 3 days in advance In other words, we would literally have to have on the agenda, the Board of Selectmen is looking to move the polling location to the town hall. It would need to be posted, has an agenda item 3 days, not the 48 hours, the 3 days in advance in order to move it to town hall.
So it's a question at that point, right, of moving the date or moving the location.
Correct.
Ellie, how does that, if the board has to then repost for 72 hours, how is that going to impact the ballot if it's due this evening?
You guys can actually wait to make that decision at your next meeting, which is going to be if you're planning on meeting next Tuesday, the 12th, because you have to vote it 20 days in advance. So you don't have to make that decision tonight. We can, but to Brett's point, it's either you change the date or you change the location.
And the only reason I suggested it is I know so many people vote early that the foot traffic, is
Pretty low.
say roughly half what it normally would be. So.
And I would, especially since we're going to have the debt exclusion on the ballot, my next thing to the Board of Selectmen would to recommend that we do early voting for the local election. So similar to how we had it at the presidential election, people could come in the week before during business hours and vote. The state law allows us to do that for local election based on the recommendation of the election official. And because we have a big project on the ballot, I would recommend that we offer early voting as well as mail-in voting. But keep in mind, so again, it comes down to we have our town meeting on May 8th and it doesn't get pushed off to May 15th. Because if we have our election on May 11th, there's a possibility we're going to an election the day of the election without having the opportunity to talk, for example, about the community center, with that question being on the ballot.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's kind of funky.
Yeah. Now, on the flip side, just for transparency purposes,
that would help us or hurt us, but
right.
help the community center, hurt the community center.
Yeah. For transparency purposes, I'd be looking to vote a week early anyway. So if you had it on May 11th, we wouldn't. We'd be voting the week before the ballot, the town meeting on May 8th, anyways. But if we move it to May 18th, hopefully the meeting gets in on May 8th, and then everyone has the opportunity to come in that following week to vote.
Yeah. I mean, I don't feel too strongly either way. It would be very unfortunate if people were asked to vote on a question that they didn't have any conversation or context for other than what was in the newspaper. It would be good for people to have that sort of public dialogue, because I think there's a lot of very strong opinions one way or the other. And I don't know that I've seen much dissent in the newspaper or in other sort of public forums. So it might be fair to the community at large to let some of those types of conversations and comments come out on town meeting floor before people go to the ballot. But again, I don't feel super strongly about it. Steve or Maureen, I don't know how you guys feel.
It sounds like we don't have to make a decision till Tuesday, so we could probably, sleep on it for a day or two.
Yeah.
Like I say, I can see the validity in both sides of the argument. Maureen, what are your thoughts?
Same here. I could just soon wait until next Tuesday and mull this over. And
So can I recommend that the agenda for next Tuesday gets posted the 72 hours in advance with the agenda item of maybe moving the polling location? So that way, if you do vote that versus changing the date, you're in compliance.
Yeah, we can do it all at once.
Yep.
Okay. So that would mean it needs to be posted by Thursday instead of Friday. Is that right?
Correct.
Okay. That's fine with me.
Yep, that works for me. So why don't we plan on that? We'll put that on the agenda for Tuesday. We'll post it on Thursday so we can do both we can make the decision one way or the other and finalize it, whether we're moving the date or moving the location. Okay.
Okay.
Okay with me.
All right. Super. Anything else on the agenda for tonight, Derek?
Brett, can I interject real quick, if that's okay?
Yeah, yes, go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, because you had talked about changing the warrant with respect to Article 2A. I just want to make sure I understand, because I don't want to talk about the whole thing. It sounds like the vote you had tonight was to totally remove Article 2A from the warrant. Is that correct?
Not at all.
Okay, so then okay, so I guess the only reason I wanted to ask the question is there was a comment made earlier about whether or not something would be allowed under the four corners of the article. So I guess my question is this, because right now it says that it will be provided that such appropriation shall be expressly contingent upon passage of a Prop 2.5 override. So
Yeah, so
the way that's worded,
yeah, I think that's going to be updated. Is that right, Derek?
So I wanted to talk to the board a little bit about what the thought process was about the warrant itself. Last week, the board voted the warrant and the articles contained to be printed and posted. But it sounds to me that before we go to print and posting, we want to see what the school committee does. So that we may want to adjust Article 2A downward, right? At least that's how I understand it. If that's not the case, then we would keep it as written.
Right. So, and I think the point, and Dave, what you're saying is totally valid, right? So based on everything we said we want to do, that language would have to change on 2A, which means we would need to vote. You know, what do we need to do to, right? Because we would need to change that, Derek, right? Because if it says it's contingent on a vote at the ballot for a 2.5 override, then that needs to change, I would think, because it's not going to be dependent on that.
That's my question.
Well, I don't necessarily, I think my opinion, again, we'll check with KP and all this, but my opinion is that you would pass over Article 2A and that you would just change the total amount under Article 2B to be appropriated to the schools.
So you would just pass over 2A, we wouldn't vote on 2A, and then we would change the appropriation, the number, the amount in 2B, and that would cover us for everything we had talked about earlier.
Right, that would provide the additional $552,000 to the schools, and then when you get to Article 9A, you would be forced to pass it over because you wouldn't be able to raise anything anyways for the dollars.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Dave, does that make sense to you?
Yes, it does. So just so that I can be clear, if Article 2A gets passed over, then that's fine. Nothing I'm concerned about. All I'm saying is that if we pass a motion from Article 2A, the way it's written right now, it says to me that there must be a Proposition 2.5 override, given the way the language is right now, because it says expressly contingent upon, regardless of what the number is. That's not the issue. It's that it says expressly contingent. So if for some reason we have to make a motion out of Article 2A and vote on it, the way the language is right now, there must be a Prop 2 override. That's all I'm saying. And if you don't want to do that, then you wouldn't say expressly contingent. That's my only point.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, that's a great call out.
Yeah, I was trying to look at the bottom of that article as we were discussing it earlier to see if it lent us the flexibility to have that be just a raise and appropriate. But that's why I had suggested KP Law look at it. But it sounds like Derek has this covered under 2B. So either way, David, I think we should be good.
Yeah, fine, because that last line is is a good catch-all to say, or to take any other action. And that does allow a lot of flexibility. But again, given the way it's worded right now, we aren't allowed that much flexibility.
That's
Okay.
right. Yeah,
So,
good.
So just make sure that the wording is correct. If we have to do 2A and you don't want a Prop 2.5 override, then that language just has to be modified. That's all.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, perfect.
Okay. Thanks
Thank
a lot.
you, sir.
Very good.
Good. That's why we're all here. This is excellent.
Right.
Okay, anything else for tonight? Derek's nodding his head. Yeah, go ahead.
I just need clarity on what we're doing with the warrant. Are we holding on the warrant until we get more information from the schools? We haven't printed the warrant as of yet. Right now, the warrant reads as was voted last week. So that's what I just trying to get a little direction as to what you guys expect.
So we can change the amounts, I would think, going into town meeting, right? So it's not a question of the amounts. Is there some other question? So what's the other question?
I didn't know if you wanted to change the language in the warrant articles as it relates to 2A. So if the school were to recertify at a lower number, would you want to change 2A to a lower number? I mean, that's ultimately the question.
Well, but if it's a low number, is that just a number? So is that considered changing the warrant or not? I guess that's what I'm confused about. I thought if we can change the number.
Once it's printed, it's printed. So once we go to print, it's going to read, $1 million. And if the school recertifies and the number is really $552,000, I'm just want to be clear that how you want it to be read. You want it to read $1 million or you want it to read $552,000?
Well, I guess go ahead, Steve.
Yeah, let me just cut for just a second. Sorry.
Oh, it doesn't matter, actually.
I'm always a fan of if it only takes 7 days to print the warrant, is it 7 or 14? I can't remember what the actual labor intensive part of printing it is, like say 14 days. I'm really in favor of trying to make sure the numbers are as accurate as they can be. So I just assume let's hold off until our meeting on Tuesday. Then we'll have a better idea. We can make this decision Tuesday because the school committee will have made their decision Monday night. And I think it would be advantageous to go to print with the most accurate number we have. I don't think it makes sense to print 5 days early and be off double money, would be my thinking.
I don't see why we won't be able to get into the town crier either. If you finalize it next Tuesday, we still have at least one more edition of the town crier to send out to all the residents.
Okay. That makes sense to me. That sounds good. Maureen, and then I know, Paul, you have a comment as well. So, Maureen, anything from you on the warrant?
No, that sounds good. I'd like the true figures in there.
Okay. Mr. Flaherty.
The issue is you post the warrant on a certain date, but the finance committee is up against the time limit as to when this document has to go to print. And if this document has to go to print by the 14th or the 15th or whatever day it is, we were talking about even earlier. I believe originally the date we were looking at was the 7th. So basically what's going to happen here is when you post the warrant, you just post Article 2. You don't see everything that is involved in the omnibus article under Article 2 where salaries, expenses, and all that are listed. People vote on the line item numbers. So what we need to have is whatever that line item number is for MURSD, it should be correct when it's printed rather than having to make an announcement at the beginning of town meeting saying, take your pen and cross out this number and put it in. Right now, it's the number in there is 444, I believe. Okay? So the finance committee is still going to have to take a vote on this because we've gone through everything accept that omnibus article number because it was still, you know, it was still a moving target last night. So I guess basically what the point is, make sure when the book goes to print that the correct number shows in that line item for MURSD. I think that's basically what I'm saying. You don't want to
Yeah.
go change it later.
Right. Right, but that
Yeah.
number is not going to change really. What we have plugged into the budget is the plug number, you know, in addition to what we funded last year. So,
Steve, the number that's plugged in there now is 444. And that
Right.
is, from what I've gathered from the time I've been trying to get in 2 meetings and come back to this one full time, is that the number is 960 or 70 or something like that, I think now. So that number has to be, well, you have to agree on a number that's going to get put in the book to be printed. And you can't wait till after the time the book goes to be printed, or at least you shouldn't. That's my take on it.
well, there's some other articles we're trying to clean up as well. So no matter what happens, we're not going to be ready to print this till next Tuesday because I think we're still waiting unless we have an update on Dennis's number. I don't want to belabor tonight's meeting. I'd like to adjourn as quick as we can because, you know, we've got next Tuesday, but I don't want to beat this up too much. But, you know, we still have snow and ice budget that needs to be cleaned up. And I think there was a reduction in the geese article, which I think has already been taken care of. So we'll try to get these things ironed up.
I think we're violently agreeing with not wrapping up the warrant tonight. So I think that covers what you're saying, Paul, and what you're saying, Steve, and I couldn't agree with both of you more. So we will review and finalize. So don't go to print, Derek. Let's wait until at least after Tuesday. How's that? We're good?
That works.
Okay. This is the longest 15-minute meeting ever, Derek. I think it was a bait and switch.
Never a 15-minute meeting, you know that.
All right. Anything else we need to cover before we wrap up?
Well, Brett, it's better than 3 hours, 29 minutes, and 59 seconds that the Finance Committee went a week ago.
It's long. It's long. All right. I'll take a motion to adjourn.
I move that we adjourn the meeting. Maureen Dwinell, aye.
Second the motion, Stephen Mattelli and I.
Brett Simus, aye. Unanimous action. Thanks, everyone. I think we made some great.
Have a good night, everyone.
Yep, you as well. Good night, everybody.
Night.
Bye.